I found out my best friend was never really my friend, and it took moving to a tropical island to see it. Hey everyone, before we get started, I just launched this channel, and I'm trying to reach my first 100 subscribers. If this story hits for you, I'd really appreciate a subscribe, and honestly, any feedback you've got would mean a lot to me. There's a version of this story where I'm standing outside my own bedroom door in my own apartment on an island in the middle of the Pacific, listening to my closest friend laugh with a room full of people I work with, and I'm not invited. That's where this ends up. But it doesn't start there. It starts almost 2 years earlier, with a joke I made without thinking that I would spend the next year of my life regretting. I want to back up and tell you the whole thing, because if I just told you about the party, you wouldn't understand why it hurts so much. You need the beginning first. So here's the beginning. I'd wanted to teach overseas since I was maybe 22. Not in a vague, someday kind of way. I mean, I had a folder on my laptop called Island Job with saved job postings in it, screenshots of teaching salaries in the Pacific, forum threads from other expats about what to pack. I used to open that folder sometimes just to remind myself it wasn't a fantasy, that people actually did this. I was 27 when the opportunity finally showed up for real, a teaching position on a small island. The kind of place where the internet cuts out when it rains and the grocery store closes for 2 hours at lunch, because everyone just kind of agrees that's the right thing to do. I applied on a whim on a Tuesday night, half convinced I wouldn't hear back. 3 weeks later, I had a video interview with a principal whose office window looked out over turquoise water, and 2 weeks after that, I had the job. I remember exactly where I was when I got the email. I was sitting on my kitchen floor, don't ask me why. I think I'd been looking for something under the cabinet, and I read the subject line twice before I let myself open it. And when I did, when I saw the words, "We are pleased to offer you," I actually put my hand over my mouth. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there on the floor, staring at my phone, feeling like my whole life had just turned a corner I didn't know was there. My partner, I'll just call him by his role in this story, my partner, because that's really what matters here. He'd been supportive from the very first time I mentioned the idea, months before there was even a real job to apply for. He worked remotely, the kind of job that could, in theory, travel with him. So when I got the offer, it wasn't really a question of, should I take this? It was a question of, how fast can we pack? I told my family. I told my friends. And because I was so happy, so genuinely overwhelmed with this feeling of my life finally clicking into place, I was generous with the excitement. Every time someone said, "Oh my God, that's amazing, I wish I could come too," I'd laugh and say, "Yes. Come. Seriously, come." It was one of those things you say the way you say, "We should get lunch sometime." It's not a lie exactly. It's just social oil. It keeps the conversation warm, and nobody actually expects you to follow up on it. Nobody except one person. I'm going to call her Jules. Jules and I had known each other a few years by that point, through university and then through a job we'd both worked at afterward. She was fun. Genuinely, I want to be clear about that, because I don't want you to think I'm rewriting the whole friendship in hindsight just because of how it ended. Jules was the friend who'd text you at 9 p.m. asking if you wanted to go get ice cream, and you'd say yes even though you had work in the morning, because she made ordinary nights feel like something was happening. She had this energy that pulled people toward her. I liked being pulled. So when I told her about the job, and she said the same thing everyone said, "I wish I could come too," I said the same thing I'd said to everyone else. Come. Seriously, come with us. I want you to understand, this was not an invitation. This was enthusiasm. This was me being so happy about my own life that I was throwing the happiness around like confetti, without thinking too hard about where it might land. Jules took it literally. I found out about an hour later when she texted me a screenshot of an email she'd just sent, her CV, her cover letter, addressed to a list of schools on the same island. Including, and I want you to really sit with this for a second, including the exact school that had already offered me a job. Not a school on the island. The school. My school. I remember staring at that screenshot for a long time. My first feeling wasn't even anger, it was this strange, hollow surprise, like watching someone take something you said in a dream and physically build it in real life while you were still asleep. I texted back something like, "Oh wow, that's so exciting, good luck," because what else do you say? But underneath that message, I felt something heavy settle into my stomach, and it didn't leave for a long time. Here's the thing I didn't say to anyone at the time, not even my partner, not fully. This job wasn't just a job to me. It was mine. I had worked for it, actual unglamorous work, filling out applications at midnight, redoing my resume 4 times, sitting through interviews where I was so nervous my hands shook on camera. I'd put myself out there in a way I hadn't for anything else in my adult life. And some small, private, slightly embarrassing part of me had pictured this whole next chapter as something that belonged only to me and my partner. Our adventure. Our reinvention. I know how that sounds. Selfish, maybe. But I think most people, if they're honest, have felt that way about something they worked hard for, that flicker of, I don't want to share this, not even with someone I like. 6 weeks after that screenshot, Jules got the job. At my school. She was moving to the same island. And because the school provided housing, and because it was easier and cheaper to combine our accommodation, the three of us, me, my partner, and Jules, ended up assigned to the same small apartment. I want to be honest with you, at the time I told myself this was fine. More than fine. I told myself I was being a good friend, that this was an incredible opportunity for her too, that having a familiar face on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean would actually be a comfort. I told my partner the same thing. We even joked about it, well, at least we won't be totally alone out there. But if you'd looked closely at my face in the weeks before we flew out, you would have seen it. That small, tight feeling behind my eyes every time someone asked, "Oh, and your friend's coming too? That's so nice." I'd smile and say, "Yes, it is. It's so nice." And some part of me, quietly, was already grieving something I hadn't lost yet. Here's your first open loop, because I promise you, this isn't even close to the worst part. What happened in that apartment over the next few months is the reason I ended up standing outside a closed door in my own home, listening to a party I wasn't invited to. But we're not there yet. Let me take you through how we got there, step by step, because every single one of those steps matters. We landed on the island in the middle of the wet season. I remember stepping off the plane and the heat just hit me like a wall thick, wet, alive feeling air that smelled like salt and diesel and flowers all at once. My partner grabbed my hand on the tarmac and just said, "We're here," like he couldn't quite believe it either. For about 10 seconds, everything felt perfect. The apartment the school gave us was small, one of those setups where you learn very quickly whether you actually like the people you're living with, because there's nowhere to hide from them. 2 bedrooms, a shared kitchen, thin walls, a balcony that looked out toward the water if you leaned far enough over the railing. Jules had one room. My partner and I had the other. The first month, honestly, was good. I want to say that clearly, because it's important for you to understand this wasn't a story where things were bad from day one. Jules was helpful setting things up. We cooked meals together. We explored the island on weekends, the three of us, laughing about how we kept getting sunburned in the same spots, how the power would randomly cut out during dinner and we'd just keep eating by candlelight like it was some kind of romantic accident. There were nights I lay in bed and thought, okay, maybe this is going to work out fine. Maybe I was worried over nothing. I want you to hold on to that feeling, because it's going to matter later when things shift. It's easy to look back at a story like this and go, well, obviously this was doomed from the start, but it wasn't obvious. Not to me, not then. It crept in slowly, the way water gets into a boat you don't realize is taking on damage until you're already ankle deep. By month 2, I started noticing small things. Little cracks. Jules had picked up on the fact that I played a particular sport back home. Nothing serious, just a weekend league kind of thing. But it mattered to me. It was one of those hobbies that made me feel like myself. There was a local team on the island, and I'd mentioned, early on, that I wanted to try to join once we settled in. A few weeks later, I found out, not from Jules, from a colleague, mentioning it casually in the staff room, that Jules had already joined that same team. Had been playing for weeks. Had never once mentioned it to me. I remember standing in the staff room holding a mug of instant coffee, forcing a smile, saying, "Oh, that's so fun, I didn't know you played," while internally doing this fast, uncomfortable math. She knew I wanted to join. She'd heard me say it. And she'd gone and done it first, quietly, without me. Maybe that sounds small to you. On its own, it probably is small. But it wasn't on its own. It was one thread in a pattern that kept repeating week after week, small dig after small dig, until I started to feel like a guest in my own life. She started making these little comments at home. Nothing you could point to directly and say, "That's rude." That's actually part of what made it so disorienting, because if I'd tried to describe any single one of them to someone else, they would have said, "That doesn't sound that bad." It was the accumulation. Little jabs about how some people needed a lot of quiet time, said while looking directly at me and my partner, who are, I'll be honest, pretty low-key people. We like early nights. We like reading instead of going out 5 times a week. Jules was the opposite. Loud, high energy, always moving, always rushing from one thing to the next, and she started treating our calmness like it was something to mock instead of just a different way of being. There was a night, I remember this clearly because it was the first time I actually felt my face get hot with anger, right there at the dinner table, where she said, out of nowhere, "You two are so boring, honestly. It's like living with my grandparents." She laughed when she said it, like it was a joke, but her eyes weren't laughing. My partner just kind of forced a smile and changed the subject the way he always did, because he hates conflict more than almost anyone I know. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, replaying the sentence in my head, trying to decide if I was overreacting to feel stung by it. I want to ask you something here, because I think this is a place where people split into two camps. Have you ever had a friend say something to you that was technically just a joke, but you knew, somewhere in your gut, that it wasn't really a joke at all? That there was something real underneath it, aimed right at you? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know I wasn't the only one who spent months talking myself out of my own instincts. It wasn't just at home, either. That's the part that made it worse, honestly, because at least at home I could go into my room and shut the door. At work, I didn't have that option. Jules and I taught at the same school, remember? And within a couple of months, I started noticing the way she talked to our principal, a soft-spoken woman who ran that school with this quiet, patient authority that I genuinely admired. Jules would go into her office and just demand things. Ask for schedule changes like she was owed them. Push back on decisions in front of other staff, in a tone that made the whole staff room go quiet and awkward. I remember one particular Tuesday, sitting at my desk grading papers, when I heard Jules's voice rise from down the hall sharp, clipped, saying something like, "Well, that's just not going to work for me," and I felt my stomach drop. Because everyone in that building knew Jules and I were friends. Everyone in that building knew we lived together. Her behavior wasn't just embarrassing in the moment. It was starting to feel like it reflected on me. I brought it up with her once, gently, in the kitchen one evening while we were doing dishes. I said something like, "Hey, I noticed things got a bit tense with the principal today. Is everything okay?" And Jules just shrugged and said, she needs to learn to actually listen to her staff, and turned the tap up louder, which I took as a pretty clear signal that the conversation was over. I didn't push it. I want to be honest about that. I could have pushed harder, at various points along the way, and I didn't. Partly because I hate conflict almost as much as my partner does. And partly, if I'm being really honest with you, because some small part of me still felt guilty. I was the one who'd said come, seriously, come in the first place, even if I hadn't meant it. I felt like I didn't have the moral high ground to complain about a situation I had, in some warped way, invited. But guilt doesn't stop resentment from building. It just makes you swallow it instead of saying it out loud. By month 3, the exclusion had gotten more obvious. It stopped being subtle. Jules started making plans with our colleagues, dinners, drinks after school, trips to other parts of the island, and I'd only find out about them after the fact, when someone mentioned it casually, assuming I already knew. "Oh, weren't you at Jules's thing on Friday?" And I'd have to smile and say, "Oh, I couldn't make it," when the truth was I hadn't even been asked. I remember one weekend in particular, lying next to my partner in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above us, and saying out loud, "I feel like a stranger in my own life." He reached over and took my hand and didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "I've noticed it too." I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to make it worse. And somehow that made it both better and worse at the same time. Better, because I wasn't imagining it. Worse, because it meant this wasn't just me being sensitive. It was really happening. Here's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that whole stretch of months. I kept waiting for it to get better. I kept telling myself, she's just adjusting, she's just stressed with the new job, this is a phase. I think a lot of us do that with people we care about. We build these little excuses for them, brick by brick, because the alternative, admitting that someone you trusted might not actually have your best interests at heart, is a much harder thing to sit with. And then came the day with the party. The day that, if I'm honest, is the day something in me finally snapped shut, like a door closing that wasn't going to open back up. It had been a long week. Longer than usual. I'd had back-to-back classes, a difficult parent meeting that ran late, and I remember walking home that afternoon with my whole body just aching for my bed. Not even food. Just sleep. I had this single, focused thought the entire walk home. Get inside, close the door, lie down, and don't think about anything for at least an hour. I opened the front door of our apartment, and the first thing that hit me was noise. Laughter. Music. The clink of glasses. I stood in the doorway for a second, genuinely confused, like I'd walked into the wrong apartment. And then I saw them, Jules, and 5 or 6 of our colleagues from the school, spread out across our living room. Someone was making cocktails at our kitchen counter. There were snacks out, the good snacks, the ones I remembered buying at the store the week before for us. Everyone was laughing at something, mid-conversation, completely at ease, completely at home in my home. Nobody had told me. Nobody had asked. I found out about this party by walking directly into the middle of it, exhausted, after the worst week I'd had in months. I felt 2 things at once, and I remember being almost surprised by how sharp they both were. The first was just simple, bone-deep tiredness, the unfairness of coming home needing rest and instead finding a room full of people I now had to perform normalcy in front of. And the second was something colder. A realization, crystallizing right there in the doorway, that I hadn't just been forgotten for this particular party. I'd been forgotten on purpose. This was my apartment, my kitchen counter, my colleagues. And somehow I was the only person in that room who hadn't been told it was happening. I didn't make a scene. That's not really who I am. I said a quiet, kind of stunned hey to the room, got a few surprised hellos back, and then I walked straight to my bedroom and closed the door. And then, and this is the part that still gets me, even now I heard the whole room go quiet. Just for a second. And then I heard whispering. And then laughter, lower this time, more careful. And then footsteps, several sets, moving upstairs, away from my door, like the party itself was relocating specifically to get further away from me. I sat on the edge of my bed and I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there, staring at the closed door, listening to muffled laughter through the ceiling, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as heartbreak. Not romantic heartbreak. Friendship heartbreak, which I think is underrated as a kind of grief, because nobody sends you flowers for it. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think about this a lot. Is there a difference between a friend who drifts away from you slowly, naturally, over time, and a friend who is actively, quietly, pushing you out? Because I think I'd convinced myself for months that this was the first kind. Sitting on that bed, listening to footsteps moving away from my door, I finally understood it was the second kind. And that distinction changes everything about how much it hurts. My partner came home about 20 minutes later, walked into a living room that was thinning out, people grabbing their things, and found me in our room, sitting exactly where I'd been the whole time. I told him what happened. He didn't say much at first. He just sat down next to me and put his arm around me, and I remember him saying, quietly, "This isn't okay. This isn't a normal way to be treated by someone who's supposed to be your friend." That night, after everyone had left and the apartment had gone quiet again, I lay awake replaying the whole thing, not just the party, but the whole arc of it, from the joke I made almost 2 years earlier to that exact moment. I thought about the version of myself sitting on my kitchen floor back home, reading that job offer email, so happy I could barely breathe. I thought about how far that version of me felt from the person lying in bed now, feeling like an intruder in her own apartment. I texted a couple of close friends back home the next morning, just trying to get some outside perspective, because I think when you're inside a situation like that for months, you start to lose your own sense of what's reasonable. And the response I got back, more or less unanimously, was some version of, "This isn't your fault, but you also need to get out of that living situation." You can't fix a friendship that's actively working against you from the inside of a shared apartment. I sat with that advice for a few days. It stung, honestly, because moving out felt like admitting defeat, like conceding that the whole tropical island dream I'd built in my head, the one where all of us thrived together, had failed. But I also knew, somewhere underneath the pride, that staying was going to cost me more than leaving would. So I made a decision. My partner and I talked it through one evening on the balcony, watching the water go dark as the sun dropped, and we agreed we needed our own place. Just the two of us. I emailed the school the next morning explaining, vaguely, that we were having some challenges in the shared accommodation and asking whether it would be possible for the two of us to move into our own unit, since the school covered our housing either way. Here's where things got messy in a way I did not see coming. My partner and I had a short work trip planned that same week to another part of the island for a training thing tied to his job. We were gone for about 5 days. And in that window, before we'd had the chance to say anything to Jules ourselves, the school, trying to be efficient, I assume, not malicious, mentioned to Jules that we'd requested to move out. I found out when I landed back on the island and turned my phone back on, to a message from Jules that just said, "So I heard you guys are moving out? Wish you'd told me yourselves." My stomach dropped reading that. Not because she was wrong to be hurt about how she found out, she was right about that part, and I felt genuinely bad about it, but because I knew this conversation was coming, and I still didn't know exactly what I was going to say. We sat down with her that evening, the three of us at the kitchen table where, months earlier, we'd eaten dinners by candlelight and laughed about power outages. I apologized, sincerely, for the way she'd found out. That part wasn't fair to her, and I owned it. But when she asked why we wanted to move, I didn't go into detail. My partner and I had talked about this beforehand. We both still had to work with her every day, piling every specific grievance onto the table. The party, the sport, the comments, the way she treated the principal felt less like honesty and more like starting a war we'd then have to live inside of, at school, 5 days a week. So I kept it vague. I said something like, "It's just not working for the three of us in this space, and we think it's healthier for everyone if we have our own place." Jules pushed a little, asked what specifically wasn't working, and I remember feeling this familiar tightness in my chest, the same one from all those months of little comments and exclusions, and I just said, gently but firmly, "I don't think going through every detail is going to help anything right now. We just need some space." She didn't take it well, not really. There was a kind of cold silence that settled over the rest of that conversation. But she didn't fight it either. I think some part of her understood, even if she wouldn't admit it. 2 weeks later, my partner and I moved into a studio apartment on the other side of the island, small, modern, with a wall of windows that looked straight out over the water. I remember the first night there, lying in bed with the window cracked open, listening to actual waves instead of muffled laughter through a ceiling. I started crying, out of nowhere, and my partner asked what was wrong, and I said, "Nothing, I think this is just relief." I want to tell you something I didn't fully admit to myself until we'd already moved out. Our relationship had been quietly suffering that whole time we lived with Jules. Not because of anything wrong between me and my partner, but because I'd been carrying so much tension, so much swallowed frustration, that I had almost nothing left over for him by the end of most days. We'd stopped really talking, the deep kind of talking, because I was too drained. Looking back, I think if we'd stayed in that apartment much longer, it would have cost us more than just a friendship. In that new studio, something shifted back into place. We started cooking together again, actually talking over dinner instead of just decompressing in silence. We'd sit out on the tiny balcony some nights with cheap wine and just listen to the ocean. I remember thinking, this is what I pictured when I got that job offer. This right here. It just took losing something else to get back to it. But the story doesn't quite end there, and this is the part one promised you earlier, the part that reframes almost everything that came before it. A few weeks after we moved, I reached out to someone I hadn't talked to in a long time, a friend of Jules's, actually, someone who used to live with her years before any of this happened, back before the island, before any of us knew each other the way we did now. I wasn't fishing for gossip, not exactly. I think I just needed to know if I was crazy. If this pattern I'd lived through was actually about me somehow, something I'd done to invite it, or if it was just who Jules was. What she told me stopped me cold. She described, almost detail for detail, the exact same pattern I'd just lived through. The exclusion. The subtle digs. The sense of being slowly, deliberately pushed to the margins of your own life while living under the same roof as someone who was supposed to be your friend. She said she'd spent over a year thinking something was wrong with her before she finally moved out and realized, with time and distance, that it had never been about her at all. I sat with my phone in my hand after that conversation for a long time, feeling this strange mix of relief and grief. Relief, because I finally had confirmation that I hadn't imagined any of it, that I wasn't oversensitive or ungrateful or any of the things I'd quietly called myself over those months. Grief, because it meant the version of Jules I'd been friends with fun, warm, the person who used to text me at 9 p.m. about ice cream either hadn't been entirely real or had been buried under something else for a very long time. And then, just when I thought that particular chapter was closing, my boss called me into her office. I remember walking down that hallway thinking it was going to be about lesson planning or the upcoming term schedule, something ordinary. Instead, she asked me to sit down, and she said, carefully, that she wanted to talk to me about some concerns she was having with a staff member. She didn't need to say the name. I already knew. She told me Jules had become a significant problem in the workplace, constantly in her office demanding schedule changes and special treatment, pushing back on reasonable requests in front of other staff, not completing her actual job responsibilities properly, while somehow also asking to leave early most days, claiming she had nothing left to do, while the rest of us stayed late trying to keep up with the workload she wasn't finishing. I sat there in that office, listening to my boss describe, professionally and carefully, the exact same person I'd been quietly walking on eggshells around for months at home. And something in me settled, finally, into a kind of clarity I hadn't had before. This wasn't a friendship that had drifted or gotten complicated by circumstance. This was just who Jules was, consistently, across every relationship she touched, friendships, work, all of it. I just happened to be one of the people close enough to feel the full weight of it. I want to ask you the second question I promised you earlier, the one that's been sitting underneath this whole story. If you found out after everything that a friend who hurt you had done the exact same thing to other people, before you and after you, would that make it easier to let go of? Or harder? Because for me, honestly, it was both. These days, my partner and I are still on that island, still in our little studio with the ocean right outside the window, and things are good. Genuinely good, in a way I don't think I appreciated enough before all of this happened. I still see Jules at work. Obviously, we teach at the same school, that hasn't changed, and I'm polite to her. I say good morning. I ask about her weekend if we pass in the hallway. But I don't invite her into my life anymore, not really, and I've stopped feeling guilty about that. I think about that joke I made almost 2 years ago all the time. Yes, come, seriously, come with us. I've thought about how differently things might have gone if I'd just said nothing, or if I'd been honest in the moment instead of being polite. But I've also come to a kind of peace with it, because I don't think this was ever really about one careless sentence. I think some people will find a way to take more than what's offered, regardless of what you actually say. And I think the real lesson wasn't, don't invite people to things, it was learning to trust that tight, uncomfortable feeling in my chest the first time it showed up, instead of talking myself out of it for months. If there's one thing I'd tell the version of myself sitting on that kitchen floor, opening that job offer email, so happy she could barely breathe, I'd tell her to keep that happiness. Don't let anyone talk you out of protecting it. Not even someone you call a friend.